Okay, well, I don't seem to have a microphone in the room, so I'll just speak loudly for the benefit of the people who are here and those of you joining us on the Zoom meeting. I want to welcome everybody here to our panel discussion about the state of the academic library with a number of distinguished leaders in our field who will share their insights in response to the recent Library Journal survey. We have a small group here in the room, and I think we have people online as well, so we'll try to make sure that we're making both audiences as comfortable as possible in this slightly awkward format. Let's get things going with a round of introductions. We'll then have a brief survey of the 2021, or overview rather, of the 2021 State of the Academic Library survey, a discussion with our panelists, and then we'll save some time for Q&A from our virtual and in-person audiences. So let's begin with a round of introductions. I'm your moderator today. I'm Katy Aronoff. I'm the Senior Director of Solutions Architecture for Ex Libris in the Americas. I'm a librarian myself, and I'm joined by a panel of experts from the world of academic libraries. If you could all just wave on the Zoom maybe when I call out your name. First, we have Kate McCready from the University of Minnesota. We have Elijah Scott from the Florida Virtual Campus, and Katy Bauer from Trinity College in Connecticut. And I feel like I should be waving back the way we all do on Zoom meetings at home. So that's our panel for today, and we will be asking them for their thoughts on some of the questions from the recent survey. Let's talk a little bit about the survey as we get started to get a sense of what our grounding is here and what it was that we just did. So this was the third worldwide academic library survey conducted by Library Journal in the spring of 2021, sponsored by ProQuest. We conducted it in 6 different languages, and there were more than 30 detailed questions. So this went out to potential survey respondents at academic libraries around the world. The results will be released in a report very shortly after the conference, and you'll be able to see some of the breakdown among regions and different people who responded to the survey. We had more than 1,800 respondents from around the world in those 6 languages. I can look up what the languages are if anybody is curious. I have that elsewhere in my notes. We focused on a few important things, and of course we were conducting this survey at a time when many libraries had not only undergone significant change, but were also still in the midst of change. I think that's been something that's been on my mind this week, being here in Charleston in person at a conference for the first time in more than 18 months and seeing some of my colleagues for the first time in almost 2 years. It's been an opportunity to reflect on what has changed in the atmosphere that we're in, where it really is still one of constant change. We are trying to identify the key missions in libraries and the challenges that libraries are facing these days. One of the things that I think is in a lot of people's minds, especially in the midst of the pandemic, is the extent to which the library has connections with the broader institution and leadership and the priorities of the institution. We wanted to understand the types of challenges that everybody faces around the world, as well as the ones that may be more pronounced or specific to certain regions of the world. And to the extent that any of us have a crystal ball, we wanted to look into that a little bit and say, what are the things that we will face in the future? Again, to the extent that we can perceive that now. Some of the high-level results, the highlights and the things that we saw that really emerged as major themes. Budgets, of course, this comes as a surprise to nobody. And of course, for many of us who have been working in and around libraries for a while, we know there are things that have happened in the last 10, 15, 20 years that continue to affect us with our budgets, even as we're looking at budget cuts now in the present. More than 66% of the respondents said that they saw their budget decreasing or remaining flat in the near future. Remote students continues to be an issue that's at the forefront of many people's minds. I like to say that we had remote students before and we'll have them again in the future, but it's something that we've all thought about in a different way in the last 2 years. there's a lot of uncertainty around cataloging practices in the future, with things like linked data emerging, questions about the viability of some of the models that we've been pursuing up until now. A lot of people have questions about cataloging. Resource sharing is another area where a lot of libraries see room for innovation and some changes to the existing models. There's been some discussion about ways that we might implement new services like controlled digital lending in light of an increased reliance on remote services and digital services in libraries. Teaching and learning and research are, of course, major themes as well. Affordable learning is something that many institutions are involved in and getting more involved in, and providing access to resources in these areas. So again, the whole report will dig into these issues and many more, but these are the high-level themes that we really saw jumping out in our evaluation of the initial results. So now I want to move into the panel discussion, and I'll explain a little bit what our approach is and our thinking in coming up with this approach. We said we could talk about the whole survey at a high level, but if you will all just plan to sit down and read the report, then you don't really need a panel to tell you what's in the report, and it might not be the most interesting approach. I come to conferences to hear people say something different and something new that I couldn't necessarily get out of reading a magazine article. So we wanted to pull out the things that we all thought were the most important and the most impactful for us, and the things that our panelists have something particular to say about. So we'll look at these 5 general areas: funding and collection development, prioritizing and promoting DEI efforts in the library, services to remote students, supporting affordability in various ways, and looking at the future of resource sharing and how we can leverage that to meet some of these other goals. And then again, we'll have a Q&A at the end. Let me just take a sip of water before we move on. For those of you who are not in Charleston, it has been unusually dry and cool here this week. It is very strange if you're used to coming to this conference and feeling, like you're really in the swamp with the swamp fox. It's not like that at all. So water's a necessity. So let's move through our questions here. So I realize that the Zoom is probably blocking part of the questions for the slides. So I'm going to minimize the Zoom panel here, and we'll be able to see all the questions in the room on the slides. The first area that we're looking at is funding and collection development. And of course, there's an intersection between our funding levels and collection development priorities. We all know that ebooks and e-journals have seen a lot of attention in our budgets in the last 2 years as we've had to support programs remotely. And the question that I want to put to our panel is, do you think that this represents, what we've just seen represents a tipping point in the way that libraries will think about collection development and think about funding for that in the future? We've all been talking about the shift to E for quite some time, for at least as long as I've been in libraries, and I think even longer. Will you be looking at things like shifting your purchasing to a just-in-time, on-demand model rather than just in case, keeping things on the shelves just in case somebody needs them? So I'd like to start with Kate, what your thoughts might be on this important question about funding and collection development.
Thanks, Katie, and hello, everyone. It's nice to be here, although I'm not there at Charleston, but it's great to be with you all. About this question, we had to, at the University of Minnesota, we had to radically shut everything down, like many libraries did. And what was interesting to me was that it was such an opportunity because for a long time we had had space issues, and I know we're not the only one. That storing our print collections was a topic that there were kind of silent, or not silent, but not as robustly heard from our collection management folks that were saying, hey, we are really full. We need to stop buying print. And our facilities and finance folks were saying, we need to reduce our physical footprint. That's costing a lot of money. And how can we do this? So when we had this moment where we really had to stop buying print entirely because we weren't there to receive it, it allowed us to kind of reset and reset the dial. And so then as we began looking more holistically at how we were going to begin purchasing print again and what we needed to purchase, because we had shifted 100% to electronic, it allowed us to decide what exactly was needed and what in physical format was important. And we really focused in on looking at our area studies collections, those things that we wanted to make sure that we were getting in equitable and diverse perspectives from smaller publishers, where we were getting things for our special and distinctive collections, and for content that didn't fit into our model, our access model, that we only purchase electronically when it's DRM free, multi-user, no kind of passwords required, things like that. So, so that definitely allowed us to scope what our physical collection development plan will be going forward. But it has been interesting in that it's shifted our operations, that we have, a physical collection development area acquisitions that's really highly hands-on and individualized. It relies on subject matter expertise, individual selector engagement, a lot of acquisition staff. And then our electronic purchasing is really highly centralized. And we do much more data analysis on use for that collection development activity. And we look at systematically reviewing usage and engagement, where we're publishing, where our faculty are citing articles. And so that's giving us a way to move to what is absolutely needed to be purchased in a licensed manner, and what can shift then to on-demand purchasing. And we have highlighted that to our users quite a bit, as well as having an on-demand option for making requests for purchases, and we're trying to honor all of those, and then ending subscriptions that really don't make financial sense when you look at the use. We're not we're trying to go beyond just looking at the rule of 5 and what is truly a metric for a subscription for the University of Minnesota.
Great, thank you, Kate. Elijah, I'd like to move to you next and hear about your thoughts from Florida on these questions of funding and collection development.
Certainly, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to everyone this afternoon. Kate makes a good point that reminded me of something that I've talked about in years past. When we think about budgets that are flat or being cut, we usually think about that in terms of collection development or maybe staffing. But, there's a bigger picture to that, which is physical space. We're not going to see large budget allocations for new physical spaces for the most part. So that really has an implication for how we do collection development that goes beyond the collection development budget itself. It forces us to really think about, okay, we really do have a limited amount of space. There's only so much that we can do in terms of weeding collections or doing some sort of off-site storage and so forth. So really, we need to rethink our collection development strategy in terms of the space as well. So it's not just a matter of we have less budget dollars available for developing print collections, but we have less budget dollars available to house physical materials. So where are we going to put things? And of course, that encourages us to make the shift to electronic as well. So for FLVC, Florida Virtual Campus, we're the library consortia for the 40 state colleges and universities across the state of Florida. And thinking about this topic in terms of what we've seen over the course of the past year plus during the course of the pandemic, we've seen things that mirror much of what Kate talks about and what was reflected in the survey results. So for many of our libraries, we know that collections budgets in general are either flat or being cut. And of course, we all know that a flat budget is really a cut budget, because every year that you have a flat budget, your purchasing power decreases as well. And then during the time period when many of our libraries were closed for the pandemic, we saw how we all had to pivot to try to still provide information resources to students, faculty, staff, to our users. And of course, the result of that was a very heavy reliance upon electronic resources as opposed to print. And I can tell you that for us, across our consortium, across those 40 institutions, when we looked at the 2020 to 2021 academic year, our checkout of physical materials dropped dramatically. In the 5-year period prior to that pandemic time period, we would average about 2.5 million circulations of physical materials, again, across the entire system. For that academic year, when many of our institutions were closed for part of the year, that number, again, across the entire system, dropped to about 340,000 items. So a substantial drop. And of course, it would have to be because the buildings were closed. You couldn't access the print materials. So that forced us to rely more heavily upon electronic. At the same time, in thinking about how we go forward, I think one of the things that we learned from this experience was to really look at our electronic collections at a much more granular level, to really think about how can we, again, in an era of either flat or declining budgets, how do we really maximize the value of every dollar that we have within those electronic collections? So I think we're going to see a continuing trend of moving away from big package deals, from the big deal, and really start looking at more granular collections, being very targeted in what we buy. And PDA and DDA packages, those give us really good options to not just buy large packages of content, but instead look at what our users are actually using. What is it that they need? What is it that they want? What's the information that's most valuable to them? And then target our budget dollars in those specific directions. So I think that's going to be the trend that we see going forward as well.
Great, thank you. Katy Bauer, I'd like to go to you next. And I think we need to acknowledge that we have two Katys and a Kate here. So we're doing our best to minimize confusion. But your perspective from a slightly different type of institution.
Yeah, right. So and you can go by Kathleen for me. That's I chose Kathleen for my just to try to make it easier for you.
Okay, we can do that.
and so hi everybody, and I am speaking to you from Connecticut. I really missed being in Charleston this week, I have to say. And I do work at a small liberal arts college, very different from the other two you've just heard from. But I would say for us that the short answer is yes. It was a tipping point for us. Going into this, we had an 8% collection budget cut fiscal year 21, and that cut carried over into this year. And that was definitely because of COVID. But there were already other pressures on our budget. And in particular, we just keep hearing about the demographic concerns. They keep talking about this cliff with students, with the numbers of students just going down. And so COVID may not continue, but we are pretty sure for us that demographic shift will, and so will the constrained budget. And I think Elijah mentioned this, that many places are looking at cutting their big deals, and Trinity is in that group. Like many places, we're using unsub, we're looking at all our journal packages. And we think that next year we can save quite a bit by getting out of the Sage deal. And in the year after that, we're going to probably be canceling Elsevier. And so this is mainly because like 80% of our budget goes to our subscriptions for journals and databases. And that just seems out of whack to us. We really want to have more of our budget available to spend on books and archives. And we see that our ebooks get a huge amount of use. Our archives are getting a huge amount of use, not so much the print books. So buying ebooks or the print books with these tight budgets, we just are going to have to make sure that those purchases are going to get used. And we can't buy things anymore that are just going to sit on the shelf, physical shelf or virtual shelf. It just doesn't work for us. Print circulation has been declining, and during COVID, that it just totally dropped off, even though we were open during much of COVID. But one case that we've had where we spent a small amount of money and it made a difference was that we looked at our leisure reading collection this year, and we had an initiative to improve it for DEI. And it was a small amount of dollars, but we saw that collection go from 25% of the titles getting used to 50%. And I'm really hoping that we can build on that and keep spending our constrained budgets in ways that we're really paying attention to what's needed. And so definitely as we're doing some of these changes and canceling some journals in particular, we know there's going to be a loss of convenience for our users. And we're going to have to talk a lot with our faculty and our students over the next year about that. But I think they just are going to need to start understanding that we can't have this situation anymore where we're struggling to do more with less. I think the message is going to be it's time to think about, how do we do? I mean, we're going to do a little. It's going to be good. We're going to do the good stuff, but it's going to be doing a little less with less.
I think that something that you just said leads pretty directly into our next set of questions, which has to do with prioritizing and promoting DEI efforts on campus. And this, of course, stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. There are other versions of this acronym in different parts of the world and maybe some different terms that are used, but the general idea of prioritizing these values in the way that our libraries provide services and the types of collections that we are assembling is something that really emerged as a trend in the survey. I'd like to ask our panelists about some of the ways that this is playing out on your campus and in your library. What are some of the ways that you're promoting and increasing the visibility of DEI efforts? And does anyone have best practices to share? So Kathleen, let's stick with you and hear about what is happening at Trinity. I know you just mentioned the leisure reading collection. And as a big leisure reader, that hits close to home for me, but I'd like to hear about the other things that are happening on your campus.
Yeah, so this was a big win for us, I think. And it took a pretty small amount of money. And I just wanted to mention that because I think that was in the survey, was that people wanted to have a better budget so they could do DEI. And I don't think that's always necessary. So I mentioned that we worked on this leisure reading collection and we saw a really big increase in circulation. So when 50% of the titles circulated last year. And so that was really pretty amazing. And this was just an effort where the collection was audited and added, I think, only about 20 books by BIPOC authors, just trying to reflect more diversity in the authors and in the subject matter. And the things that we did that worked well that I thought I would share. So it was kind of a grassroots effort. We had a group of librarians who were just really passionate about this, and we empowered them, told them, figure out what you need to spend and we'll see if we can fit it into the budget. And they knew, so we have this collection, millions of volumes, print and digital, and that's kind of overwhelming, but they decided to just focus on this one small collection. It's fairly discreet. It's less than 200 books altogether already. And that made it manageable. And it was really good. They brought students in early on the selection process and worked with student groups who were interested in this. And, it was really easy to get students to help out with this. They were thrilled to be asked and they were thrilled to work on it. And that continued after we had this launched. When students would have events, they would sometimes invite us to attend and we'd bring a little pop-up library with us. And that was very successful. The librarians built guides for this collection and they made the material easy to discover. And I will say that we used our Alma catalog. It has a collection tool in it that was really helpful in this case. And I know in the past, the collection tool was kind of clunky. It was hard to use. The displays weren't great. And I think it's gotten a lot better. So I would recommend to those of you who are Alma customers you might want to take a look at that again. And it was just a small amount of money and it's been a really big win. So we're going to continue on with this. We're going to keep looking at small, discrete parts of the collection that we think will be high use. And the next one we're going to do is climate change. And we'll be looking at it holistically. It's not just going to be from a DEI initiative, but looking at it to make sure we have foundational text. But we also just want to make sure that we're looking at economic effects, especially on poor communities, urban communities, marginalized areas, and looking beyond the US, all over the world. And we just want to make room in this for diversity of thought, but, trying to avoid misinformation and bad science. And we are mostly going to purchase ebooks for this, I think. We're not going to go back to buying a lot of print. But, and also looking at streaming video and data sets, because definitely video just needs to be considered. And so just as I said, I don't think budget should be an impediment to this. It's just more about how you incorporate it into your regular decision making. And I think you can get a big win from it. A bigger hurdle that I see ahead is just that we've got to start thinking about our entire collection, which is old and which definitely has some material that would be considered racist, frankly, harmful in some ways. And I don't want to erase the past. I don't want to censor, but we're going to have to think about, should some of this material move into a special collection and should some of it just be weeded? And we'll have to talk with students about this and about the historical bias in our collections.
Some big topics there. Kate, I'd like to move to you for your thoughts on ways that your library is prioritizing or promoting DEI efforts on campus.
So, we're here at the University of Minnesota, and we are located very close to where George Floyd was murdered. Many of our staff lived very, very close, and it was a hard time in our city, but it was such a important time for us to really wake up and pay attention to the work that needs to be happening to create more diversity, equity, and inclusion in our libraries, in our communities, in our world. But we, as a library, we really tried to do a holistic look at what we needed to do. So on the collection side, we jumped into action. Sunshine Carter, our collection development officer, and myself, along with our university librarian, Lisa German, we created a fund very immediately to just purchase every material that we could, knowing that we were going to be kind of inundated with requests for books on diversity, equity, and inclusion, for coursework, for popular reading. And so we immediately jumped into action on that. And we looked at reading lists and just really amped up our acquisitions work. Then we formed a small group of liaisons with relevant expertise. There was a group of 5 folks. And they began kind of systematically looking at where there were gaps in our current collection development activities. And they began doing some purchasing there, working on adjusting our approval plans to focus on interdisciplinary subject headings to try and create more diversity in our collections that were coming on approval plan. And we have now rechartered that group to create a roadmap for racial equity in our collections. And they're looking at a variety of current practices, how to help other selectors in other fields do more work within engineering and other things that we don't immediately think of about diversity or equity or inclusion. And so they're working on a roadmap. The goal is to have the roadmap done in the winter, and that will look at a multi-pronged approach of how we're going to look at our collections, what kind of historical look, we'll look at our legacy collections, et cetera. And then on the organizational development side, we knew that we wanted to hire a diversity officer kind of right when our new university librarian had started, which was 2 weeks before the pandemic began. And then we went into a hiring freeze. So we moved into the idea of starting with an assessment. And we have just finished that. That happened over the course of this summer. And the assessment was, what are we doing right? Where do we need to improve? What is your experience at the University of Minnesota libraries? And then that will inform the plan of action that we take as an organization. We are hiring a new organizational development, diversity, equity, inclusion officer, and that job description, I think, is just being finalized. And so we're excited to kind of see the results of the survey, the assessment, and to make a plan for moving forward to increase kind of our staffing and our awareness and our training. Although we had done a lot on that in the past. We're a pretty progressive state and city and organization in a lot of ways. So we had already been doing a lot, but we're focusing on what else we need to do. And the last thing I wanted to mention is our communications office has set up a series of a speaker series called Amplifying Black Narratives, and it focused on the first session. There's 3 sessions. The first session focused on the archives and special collections. The next focused on kind of publishing and libraries. And the third is about authoring opportunities. And that third one has yet to happen. That's on November 18th, but they're all videoed and available on our website. And those have been fantastic conversations and given us really concrete things to be thinking about that we want to take action on as well.
Great, thank you. So finally, we'll move to Elijah to hear your perspective on DEI efforts at the libraries in Florida.
Sure. So as the consortium, when I talk to my colleagues at the libraries who are members of our consortium, I hear many things that echo what we've just heard from Kathleen and from Kate. I really like what Kathleen said about involving students in the work, to really get the students into the work and to understand their needs, their perspectives on this, and what we can do to really hear from them, because that's where we add value to the collections in this way, is by really hearing from our users. I think, just as a general statement, to sort of sum up what I'm hearing from our member libraries, we all know that this is very challenging work. It can be very difficult work, but I would also propose this right now in this moment. This is the most important work that we can do to best serve our users, but it's also the most important work that we can do, as Kate was saying, for organization development, to best serve ourselves, to make sure that our libraries as organizations are the best that they can possibly be.
Great. Succinct and to the point. I'd like to move on to our next question, and as we do that, do a quick time check. We're at 12:49 Eastern, and we have about 15 minutes left, maybe a bit more, for the discussion portion, and then we'll move to the Q&A. So just to help our panelists plan their responses as we move to our remaining questions. We'll be talking now about serving remote students, and this is an area of our operations that I think is obviously very tightly connected to the idea of collection development and how we allocate our budgets. I think there are some really serious implications here for equity in particular when we talk about serving remote students. So we're continuing with some of the themes that we have spoken about already. And I'd like to hear from the panel about what your libraries are focusing on to support remote patrons, and lessons learned in the last year or so, or new ideas that you might have and want to try in the future. Elijah, we'll stick with you for the first response to this question, or series of questions about serving remote students.
Thank you. One of the services that we provide from FLDC is a statewide collection of e-resources for all of our member libraries. And already prior to the pandemic, we were working on implementing a new authentication platform to make it easier for our users to access those electronic resources remotely. So we've been working on implementing Open Athens. And at the time we started, the thought was we just need to do this. It makes it easier for our users to access the resources. From our side, it gives us better data and data analytics opportunities and so forth. But it turned out to be very timely. And so as we moved into the pandemic area and many of the libraries were closed for a period of time, we really saw the value of seamless access to those e-resources. So one of the things that stood out was the ways in which Open Athens as an authentication platform eliminates the need for the user to start from the library. So in years past, in other libraries I've worked at, when we used something like Easy Proxy, the user had to start with something like the library catalog or maybe a LibGuide, some library webpage that had the authentication built into a link to get to an electronic resource. With Open Athens, by decoupling that and instead making it seamless for a user who might be doing a Google Scholar search or some other search in the wild on the web, they might find an article from a scholarly journal. They had no idea whether or not their institution subscribed to that journal, but could click on the right link there at the journal and find out that in fact their institution did subscribe, and they could log in using the same credentials that they used for all of the other campus services and resources. So they didn't have to know any extra credentials, any unusual username, and so forth. So we really saw the value of that during the pandemic, when suddenly all of our users were working remotely. They didn't have easy access to a librarian to get help, and they didn't have easy access to library instruction to train them how to find those e-resources and how to access them. So that's one thing that really helped us. And actually, in the interest of time, I'll stop there and pass the baton back.
Okay, thanks. I don't mean to rush people. I just want to make sure we can cover as much of our material as possible. Kathleen, I'd like to move to you next to hear about how you're working with remote students at Trinity.
Yeah, so when the COVID crisis hit and all our students went home and we had to shut down the library, it was a huge crisis, but it was also liberating. It let us try some things that we'd wanted to do for years and hadn't quite had the quite have the will to do it. So we switched to ebooks preferred, and that's going to continue. We're not going back to print preferred. We abolished fines because students left and they couldn't get books back to us, and we didn't want to charge them for it. And fines aren't coming back. And I think that's a really good thing. And to anybody out there who did something similar, and it hurts your budget because you're supposed to bring these fines in. And I've been told that we are eligible to get some of the federal emergency money that colleges have gotten, that this is something that will cover, at least for that year. We did more direct mailing, and we will continue to do more of that. We mailed books directly to students. We mailed books to faculty. We started doing direct shipments from Amazon to faculty and to sometimes to students. And we're continuing to do a small amount of that. We now pull, people will request books from us. We pull them, we check them out, and we leave them out for people to come and pick up. And that's been really popular with our patrons. We did a lot more on-demand digitization for our reserve services, and we're continuing to do that. One of the things that we found was that there was a huge need for technology. And so we've beefed up some of the technology we have to loan to students. This was a big hurdle for students who, when they had to go home, and some of them did not have as good a setup at home as far as access to internet, as far as technology, or even just having a quiet place to study. And I will say that while we are better positioned now to support remote users, our students really do prefer to be on campus, and that will stay, the main part of what we do at Trinity. It did, though, just bring a lot of changes to our services that I think were ultimately good.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks. Kate, we'll move to you to hear about how the University of Minnesota has served remote students and any new plans or new ideas for the coming year.
Sure. So a couple of things that we did. One that I didn't mention in our collection development piece is the EBA programs. We implemented 6 evidence-based acquisition programs that ended up saving us $50,000 and increased access to titles by 3,000%. So that was kind of a big thing, and something I would really recommend everybody take a look at. The other thing that we did is we launched a home delivery of our physical collections because we were completely closed for a while. And we've determined that that will not end, that we are going to look, though, at our total suite of services, because we have interlibrary loan and digital delivery, where we do article and book chapter scanning. We do get-its, which are delivery to individual offices and the dorms, and the hold shelf at the libraries for pickup. We have all these services. So we're going to look, we're going to step back and look holistically at all the services that we have, including that home delivery of physical collections, and determine a new path forward for how we're presenting those options to our affiliates. And I think I'll just stop with that.
Okay, great. Yeah. Lots of, I think, interesting and relevant food for thought on the topic of remote students. They are certainly not going anywhere. As evidenced by this panel, I feel like we are all remote students today at this conference. The next topic that I'd like us to tackle is the issue of affordability. And I think this is something that, again, has links to the previous topics that we've discussed. Certainly when we think about remote learning, we're thinking about course materials and other things of that nature. We learned from the survey also that libraries are leading 35% of affordable learning initiatives at academic institutions, and a bit more than 75% of libraries are involved with providing open educational resources to their patrons. And supporting faculty through the provision of course materials was something that a lot of respondents rated as a very high priority of theirs. I'd like to hear from our panelists about your library's commitment to affordable learning, whether it involves a mandate at the state or institution level, how you're working with that, and what are some of the specific approaches that your library takes. I am always very interested in hearing about specific practical approaches coming from an access services background myself. So Kate, we'll stick with you for the first set of thoughts on this question about affordable learning.
Thanks. So our university had launched a strategic plan a year ago, maybe. And one that we have 5 commitments. They're not called goals, they're commitments. And one of those is student success. And within that goal, there is a strategy of reducing student debt. So the libraries then have attached to that to look at how we can support student savings, and a lot of that has been through the affordability of course materials. And we launched a student advisory board as well this year. Mostly that's, I believe, undergraduates, and we're engaging them in looking at these services and how they should be scoped and presented. But what we're doing currently is to really leverage our library course pages that we have embedded in Canvas, and that we're using Leganto, where we're able to leverage our collections, our licensed materials, by putting those materials into the courses. We do have a copyright permission service where folks, want to use something that's beyond fair use in their course materials, and we're doing a lot of advocacy and education there to rethink their course materials to find more affordable options. Although we know that faculty, this is their choice, so that there's a lot of autonomy there and academic freedom there for selecting course materials, so we have to be sensitive to that. We also, in our interlibrary loan, we borrow course materials for students. We have a publishing services where we're creating new open access textbooks and are working with individual faculty members for that. And if they're not quite ready at that point to actually create an open textbook, we offer a university-wide Pressbooks instance through Unizin that allows any faculty or instructor to set up course material portion for their students, where that would be more affordable and materials that they're providing that they have developed. So we have kind of a full suite that we're trying to find ways, and we do dedicate money. The last thing that we do, we dedicate some specific funds to look at what the bookstore is making available and see if there's any multi-use ebook copies. And we do have a nice partnership because we have with our bookstore, because they're an independent bookstore still, where we can get the list of titles that are being assigned.
Independent bookstore. That's it's quite unusual these days. Elijah, I'd like to move to you to hear about how the FLVC libraries are supporting affordable learning.
So I'm really glad to say that this is actually part of our statutory requirements. FLVC is defined in Florida statute, and one of our requirements is to promote and provide recommendations concerning the use of affordable textbooks and education materials. So that's really one of the core pieces of our overall mission. In serving the 28 state colleges and 12 state universities, we know that there are some really rich and robust activities happening on all of those campuses. So as the consortium, we try to be that sort of central space where they can all come to share ideas, to share best practices, to tell each other what they're doing and how they can support each other. So one of the things that we've done to support this work is create a community of practice called Open Florida. And you can find this on our website. And I say that because it's not limited to just Florida. It's open to anyone. So Open Florida is a community of people, librarians, teaching faculty, administrators, anyone who's interested in issues around textbook affordability, affordability of materials related to courses and educational materials. And the community has regular meetings where we discuss best practices, current trends, emerging trends. What are the things that are happening at all of the different campuses that we serve, where our users can support each other. So again, this is not limited to anyone from Florida. And we encourage folks to join this conversation who are interested in the same topic. A couple of other things that we do as a consortium. We do an annual summit, an Open Education Resources Summit. We usually have between 200 and 300 participants each year. And that, again, is not limited to Florida. That's open to anyone who's interested in participating. And so we're working right now towards a spring summit for spring of 22. That will be the 5th of those annual summits that we've done. And then the other thing that we do that really, I think, has been a part of the national conversation on textbook affordability is the FLVC Textbook Affordability Survey. This has been administered 4 times over the past 10 years and is cited innumerable times. You'll see this mentioned in almost any conversation about textbook affordability. And we're going to release the next iteration of that survey in the spring as well. And that longitudinal data across tens of thousands of student responses is really useful in seeing how things are changing and developing in this area. So I hope that you'll keep an eye out for that next set of survey results from us. So those are some of the ways that as a consortium, we are participating in the textbook affordability conversation.
Great, thank you. So finally, on the subject of affordable learning and course materials, Kathleen, I'd like to hear about what you are doing in this area at Trinity.
Sure. So we don't have a mandate at Trinity, and which would be a nice thing to have, but we have had a pilot project going on for a couple of years where we give faculty, they apply and we give them a small stipend to examine OER materials. And then if they decide to use those materials in their course, they get an additional $1,000 stipend. And that's been enough to interest faculty in using OER. But I will say that what we have found with faculty, while they'll say they care about affordability, the thing that will really get them excited and want to participate is when we talk to them about their ability to take the material and reuse it however they see fit, because usually that's part of OER, right? It's not just affordability, it's that ability that you have to reuse the material, and that tends to get them interested. So I think in the spirit of time, I'll leave it at that.
No, that is a really insightful comment that I see, people in the room are nodding. And I think a lot of us who have experience working with faculty can relate to that. So we have about 10 minutes by my count left in our time together. And what I'd like to suggest to the panel, unless somebody strongly disagrees, is that we move to take some questions from the audience to bring some interaction into the discussion. I see we have in the chat, and Kate has answered the question about what an independent bookstore is. So this is good, and I'll read it out loud for the benefit of those in the room. Although we do have the projector, it might be small. Kate says, our independent bookstore is a bookstore that is owned by the University of Minnesota, not a corporate national for-profit bookstore like Barnes and Noble. So this is an unusual arrangement these days, and it may provide some benefits or flexibility. I have my colleague Alison Roth from ProQuest here to help us moderate some questions. Hi, Alison. So Alison, do you have anything in the Q&A that has come to us from the audience?
So far, we don't have anything, but if you do have questions and you're joining us virtually, please put them in the Zoom chat. That'll be easier for us to read out.
Yes. So we do have a question in the room, and I will repeat it. Oh, in the Pathable chat. Okay. Allison, do you have access to the Pathable chat?
I do. Let's see. It looks like, yeah, I think this was more of a comment than a question, but somebody commented, and I think this can certainly be turned into a question, that their institution is trying to ramp up research output and improve its research profile, but cutting journal subscriptions threatens this initiative.
I think that is something that maybe we want to ask our panelists to react to. Does anybody have any immediate thoughts on this question of whether cutting journal subscriptions can affect your research output in a negative way, particularly for an institution that may be trying to raise its profile? We have a comment in the room here that says, publish where they want to publish. Yeah. Okay, yeah. Right. So unless people can hear the comments in the room, I will repeat them for the Zoom. Okay, you cannot hear them. One of our in-person attendees says that she works with at a medical library with medical patrons. They tend to have the money for the article processing charges, and they can publish where they would like to publish. So it may be less of an issue, but I think maybe we're also thinking about researchers who need access to specific journals and what the implications are if the library doesn't have those. I don't know if anybody from the panel has any reactions to that. Maybe we sort of let that comment sit and speak for itself, but I don't know if anyone has something specific to say.
Well, part of the analysis we have to do before we cancel is to analyze where our people publish. So that is something we're going to consider really carefully. The other thing that we've done, we didn't talk about resource sharing, but we have worked really hard on speeding up interlibrary loan, which I know is not perfect, it's not panacea, and it is a barrier. But our faculty will still be able to get material, and by working with Rapid, and speeding up our processes and working with other schools that are committed to being fast, we get articles to them in about an hour. So they can still discover things. They have to request, which isn't perfect. But I mean, as I said, it's not, I wish we could provide everything, but I just don't think that it's something that we can do anymore. So something's going to have to give.
Right. To the extent that I think anybody, but except for the absolute largest libraries, was providing everything, it's maybe not something we can do as much.
We're in the exact same boat as Kathleen described. So it's I think we're probably at a little bigger scale, but we're doing the same thing, with doing really deep analysis, looking at what we need to do more on a individual case-by-case basis, and how do we increase that turnaround time?
We had a question in the Pathable chat. This is a good question. Changes in demographics was brought up earlier. Are academic libraries taking any steps to plan for that, or what are their institutions doing? And by changes in demographics, she means fewer traditional age students enrolling.
our panelists, who would like to address this first? Kathleen, I think this was a comment that you had made, and certainly at a traditional liberal arts college like Trinity, it's an issue that looms large. But I think for all of us, it's something we've heard about and we're thinking about.
Right. So, the big fear has been that the traditional age students, there just aren't as many of them, and we're all fighting to get the same students in the door. So the non-traditional age students is that's sort of this appealing group that we do have special programs for, and our library does, we do reach out to this program and the advisor for the program, they're taking the same classes, they need the same resources. The only thing we have found is that they have different needs as far as when they need support. They're more likely to want to meet with someone in the late afternoon or in the evening. And so we've had to adjust for that. But I think their resource needs have been very much the same. The switch to digital actually, helps them a lot.
Yeah. I'm really curious, Elijah, your thoughts on this at the state level in a big and diverse state like Florida. And I will say that as somebody who worked at a community college myself, I have some thoughts on this that maybe come from a different end of the spectrum. So I'm curious to hear what you have to say.
Well, we probably think alike, Katie, because much of my background is also in community colleges. Yeah. But it's similar to what Kathleen was saying. We know that our non-traditional students are often working either part-time, more likely working full-time. They probably have families. They may have young children. So they need clearly the same resources for a course that other students would, but how they want to access those, and as Kathleen said, when they want to access those resources or when they want to access other services, it can be really different. So we need to think about the value of electronic access. That really helps the non-traditional student who may have to do coursework late at night after finishing working all day, putting kids to bed, finishing up dinner, all the different things that may happen in family life. And they may have a really specific period of time when they can work. So that electronic access, not just to the research material, but to help. So for instance, can we provide a 24/7 live chat service, something like that, that's connected to our electronic resources? How do we make sure that those students who are working on a very different time cycle than the traditional student, how do we make sure they have access not just to the information resources, but as Kathleen was saying, to the support services as well?
Yeah. Hey, do you have thoughts on this from the perspective of a very large research institution, public research institution in a city?
What we've just been anticipating is that we're going to have more budget cuts, and how to really focus in on our strategic plan and get very clear priorities of what it is we need to support and where we are going to need to make changes. So we've been doing a lot of strategic thinking around kind of the bigger picture of what we're providing.
So I think we're down to our last minute here. Alison, is there anything else that's really urgent or pressing from the chat, or should we move to wrap up? You are on mute.
Sorry, you'd think I'd have learned after a year and a half of remote working to take myself off mute. Yeah. There was one other comment with regard to resource sharing and ILL. Somebody said other pressures include meeting the needs for faculty, graduate, and undergraduate research, and thinking about what's reasonable to provide via ILL versus having to own or license.
Yeah,
not a question, just a good comment.
No, that's a great comment, and I think a great note for us to end on, that we can think about diverse ways of serving our populations that may, the material comes from different places, but we want it in the hands of patrons. So I want to thank everybody who participated, our group here in the room, everybody on Zoom, and I want to thank Alison and our moderator from the conference who are here in the Zoom session for helping to support us. Pulling something like this together when we're all in different places has been challenging, but I think very rewarding. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I want to thank all of our panelists for participating and for the work that you did to prepare for this. So thank you to everybody. Enjoy the tail end of the conference, and we hope to see you here in Charleston next year. Thanks, everyone.